2. Eternity and time. James Dan, in his attack on Van Til's philosophy, was especially critical of Van Til's view of time. Because Van Til so clearly emphasizes the priority and ultimacy of the sovereign and triune God over time, Dan held that time and history had no real place in Van Til's thought. He maintained that Van Til's thought reveals that characteristic disregard for chronological time which appears in all absolutistic systems of thought. Implicit in Dan's entire position is the requirement that time and history have priority. Unless Adam's every act was itself ultimate, rather than an aspect of God's creation and decree, Adam, for him, is denied reality. He thus held that Van Til's theology denies Adam's individual reality. Van Til must reduce Adam to a mere generality in order to avert the collapse of his whole system. Van Til's common grace theology has no room for Adam. A careful search ends in the cry, "Adam, where art thou?" The tables, of course, can be very easily turned on Dan. If ultimacy means reality, then Dan, having made Adam real, has made God unreal, so that we can ask of Dan's God, "Where art thou?" Priority and ultimacy, having been given to Adam and time, are denied to God and eternity. Dan, however, is not ready to go quite that far. Instead, he wants to give priority to the revelation of Jesus Christ in history. In fact, Dan himself begins to downgrade calendar time, saying that the Bible has only secondary interest in time as computed by days and years. Moreover, neither the clock nor the calendar can truly divide time. In consequence, neither can discriminate between times and tell us what time it is. Christ alone can truly divide the time. He alone can separate the present from the past and the future in such a manner that the past is truly past, the present decisive, and the future sure. It is He, not the clock or calendar, that introduces the great divide, the real distinction between this age and the former age, between His hour and the hour of the Prince of Darkness. Dan has denied ultimacy to the ontological Trinity. On the other hand, while bringing ultimacy down to earth, he has avoided giving it to time as such. Instead, he gives it to the Christ events, an historical moment. As Van Til has analysed Dan's philosophy, to have Christ as the true divider of time, we must not think of him as working according to the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. We must not have back of him the eternal counsel of God, according to which all things come to pass. For, in that case, the coming of Christ would be no more revelatory of God and his purposes than a victory of the White Sox would be. Truly Christological approach must, therefore, be one which would truly replace the central principle of sovereignty as such, and must therefore, according to Dan, exclude the all-controlling providence of God, and, at the same time, ascribe secondary significance to the clock and the calendar. Dan gives ultimacy to the Christ events, an historical moment, not to the Christ who reigns eternally in heaven as the second person of the Trinity. To do so would be to give priority to eternity, which he refuses to do. Since he does not want to give priority to time and history as such, and thus to man, because it would be open humanism, Dan gives it to a Christ event, which is detached from the eternally sovereign and reigning second person of the Trinity. A formal Christianity is retained, but the sovereignty of God has been, in effect, denied. For the Orthodox Christian, the triune God is ultimate, and the whole of creation is his handiwork, and thus derivative. It does not undercut the reality of the creation, and thus of time, to say that it is created. Rather, it simply identifies the kind of reality it is. The issue of the relation of the eternal to the temporal is put into proper perspective by Van Til. Again, if we are asked, what do you think of the relation of the eternal to the temporal, we reply that the eternal for us does not exist as a principle, but as a person, and that as an absolute person. Accordingly, we do not use the eternal as a correlative to the temporal, we use the notion of the eternal God as the personal creator of the temporal universe. Once more, if men ask us as to which is first, becoming or being, we reply by saying, first of all, that the term becoming cannot be applied to God. God's being is not subject to becoming. He is eternal being. And, as for created being, it is in the process of becoming by virtue of the plan of God. God's being is therefore before the becoming of the created universe. The eternal one and many are prior to, in quotation marks. It will readily be seen that if our theory of reality is true, we cannot simply say that God is prior to the universe, meaning by prior to, temporal priority. Inasmuch as God is not subject to time, we cannot enclose him in the calendar. God is the creator of time itself as a form of created being. On the other hand, if we say that God is, quote, prior to, end quote, the created universe, we do not simply mean what is usually meant by logical priority. God is, to be sure, logically, quote, prior to, end quote, the created universe, but he is logically prior by virtue of the fact that he has actually created the universe with its temporal form out of or into nothing. Without the notion of temporal creation, the notion of logical dependence cannot be maintained. The attempts at ascribing ultimacy to the Christ event rather than to God, the ontological Trinity, or to man directly, come to focus in Karl Barth. Barth saw the impotence of humanism clearly. Time loses meaning where time becomes ultimate. Barth's spiritual crisis, however, was not a disillusionment with man and time as such, but with their impotence were given ultimacy. Barth wanted man and time to have the centrality humanism gives them, but with the potency Christianity gave them. As a result, by turning to the incarnation, the Christ event, Barth saw this event as God becoming man in time and temporal man participating in the eternal God. Of God beyond that event, Barth wanted to know nothing. God had done his duty by providing the Christ event, whereby the inescapable potentiality of every man was revealed. As Van Til pointed out, according to Barth, the whole question of the relation of eternity to time is identical with the question of the relation of God to man in Jesus Christ. We are not to discuss the question of how eternity can become time or how time can participate in eternity, and after that to ask to what extent Christ is both eternal and temporal. We are rather to begin with the great principle earlier discussed, namely, that Jesus Christ as the fact and act of God's presence with man, and as the act of man's participation in the being of God, is the source of all possibility. It is Jesus Christ as Geschichte, who is both the ground of being and of knowledge for man in all things. To put it brutally but still accurately, the purpose of the God of birth system is to act as the stud in order to provide man with the potentiality for meaning and life he requires, and after that, Barth's God must disappear and refuse to speak or to be known. For sterile theologies, Barth's system offered false hope and a false pregnancy. Barth's failure is not surprising, as Sass has observed in another context. In language and logic, we are the prisoners of our premises, just as in politics and law, we are the prisoners of our rulers. Hence, we had better pick them well. Every premise which includes the ultimacy of time is doomed to collapse into meaninglessness and self-negation. The Hebrew word for time is derived from the changes of the seasons. Time is change, but change without meaning is an oppressive fact. Philosophies which have as their premise the ultimacy of time in a world and life negation, and the desire to escape from life into a nirvana of nothingness. If time is only an endless cycle of change, then history is nothing more than a meaningless repetition. When Carlyle's faith was reduced to its essence, all he held, as he observed in the French Revolution, was that there is nothing else but revolution or mutation. Great men might briefly hold the centre of the stage, but change alone continues, and it has no meaning. Where no transcendental meaning exists, and the only truly transcendental meaning comes from the sovereign and triune God, and the fact that He is maker of heaven and earth, man's recourse, then, is to create a private meaning and read it onto and into the world and events. This is simply superstition, which is an irrational feeling or belief which is projected onto reality. Superstition becomes the recourse of men who reject the ontological trinity, and the more pronounced their rejection, the more pronounced their superstition. Thus, when Nietzsche rejected the God of Scripture and affirmed a belief in time and history as cyclical, he was then a prey to superstition. Bentley has commented on one aspect of this. Throughout the year 1881, as we learn from Nietzsche's letters to Pieter Gast, Nietzsche was haunted by a fear that this year might be fatal to him, because all events recur, and he had attained the age at which his father died. It is evident that Nietzsche's belief was no mere doctrine of cyclical epochs, but a superstitious obsession, an illusion, which, in the manner of a paranoiac, he built into a system. As against Bentley, we must point out that it was Nietzsche's rejection of God which led to his superstition and paranoia. Freud also was a prey to superstition. He believed that his time of death was set in terms of superstitious ideas, and that he would die in February 1918, and he often referred to this date in resignation. He was given to numerological ideas. When February 1918 passed without his death, instead of blaming himself, Freud commented, "That shows how little trust one can place in the supernatural." He kept his 73rd birthday quiet because of the numbers involved. He held that there is an inner connection between urinating and writing. The third date he set for his death was 80 and a half, the age at which both his father and his brother Emmanuel had died. He resorted to magical actions to avoid disasters, breaking precious objects to avert them, or to compel actions in others. We have some evidence as to how these superstitions developed. Thus, we know how he decided he would die at 62. It appears that in the autumn of 1899, two events had coincided, one highly important, the other banal. The former was the publication of his great work, The Interpretation of Dreams, when he was 43 years old. The publication date of 1900 is incorrect. The other was his being given a new telephone number, 14362. Some months later, at the time of the break with his numerological friend, Fleece, the numbers suddenly came together and acquired significance. 43 being common to both, there was left 61 and 62. Freud equated the superstitious belief with the thought that, with the interpretation of dreams, his life's work was done, so that nothing more need to be expected of him, and he could die in peace. These are examples of crude superstitions, and they abound in the lives of the prominent humanists. But superstitions need not be crude to be unreal. Superstitions are, as we have seen, irrational feelings or beliefs which are projected onto reality. They can be highly sophisticated and philosophical, but such feelings and beliefs are still superstitious. Bentley, as we have seen, traced Nietzsche's philosophy of time and history to superstition. We need not limit the application to Nietzsche. Wherever men in philosophy have departed from the ontological trinity and his infallible word as their starting point, they have fallen into superstition. Having denied ultimacy to God, and having then ascribed it to man and time, they must then project, as a new law of being, as a new eternal decree, the conclusions of man's mind onto the universe, and read time as a pattern of man's ideas. This superstitious effort, which is also magic, was summed up in Hegel's conclusion that the rational is the real. Mind incarnates itself in time to realize its decree. But time does not move to man's ideas nor to his heartbeat, so that man must then turn bitterly against his hope, time, and, like Trumbull Stickney, reject past and future for a forlorn and futile hope in the present. In Sartre, the existential moment is everything, and man must therefore become his own God in a world without God and without meaning. The attempt is a futile one, and Sartre himself concluded that man is a useless passion. If there be no God, then, ultimately, there is no man. If there be not eternity, then time too collapses into meaninglessness. The ultimacy of God and eternity, or, more accurately, of the eternal God, is the guarantee of the reality and meaning of time, man, and history,